Rodney wasn't having a good life lately. He just wasn't. Let's leave it at that, where descriptions are concerned. Where to begin? First, Laura tells him that she's not happy and that she wants to try a different kind of life. She tells him that after 5 fucking years of both of their lives spent together. After giving her his heart and moving across the country to help her reach her career goals. In the end, though, he sucked it up and he tried to realize his anger for what it was. Irrational. Typical breakup shit. He wasn't her boss, and he knew he wasn't entitled to her love. So, through the mist of the hurt, he watched her pack her suitcase and her bags. He watched her hand in her keys to the landlord, and he watched her walk out the door with her things, helped by her friends. And then he watched through the window as she got into her car and drove off. As he watched, he felt something that, even to the very end, he didn't know how to describe. Not really. It was a mix of his heart, the emotional core of him hurting. This dull, constant ache that just got bigger and bigger and more concentrated. Later, as he lay in bed that night, that ache had morphed into an all-consuming void of raw hurt, like his heart had been torn out. It lasted into the morning, then into the next week, and on after that. Eating his breakfast, getting dressed, going to work, then coming home at night and going to bed. He just lived his life. It was all he could do, even though everything was different now. Everything had changed as she'd left. Even though he tried not to, he couldn't help but think of their life spent together, and that made living with her absence all the more painful. How they'd lie in bed at night, entangled in each other's arms. The way her voice sounded when she laughed. How she was the toughest person he knew. How nothing in the world could put her down and keep her down. How she always had an answer and a plan for every life difficulty that came her way. The way her body felt when they made love, their hearts beating in rhythm, her body draped in sweat as he grasped at her skin. He remembered all this, and over the course of events, until things took a sudden turn, he would constantly remember it. And it hurt. It hurt so bad. So, this was his life. So, suffice it to say, Rodney didn't quite know how to feel when he got a package by courier. On that warm summer afternoon with the sun shining bright and high in a cloudless sky, he eyed and weighed the large box in his hands. It was from Laura's grandmother, the courier explained to him. She died, and the will stipulated that these items, which Laura had inherited, be mailed to her. As this was her last known address, he was the one who now had to deal with the entire matter. 15 minutes later, Rodney, glancing occasionally at the package, sitting comfortably by the couch in the living room, was leaning against the wall, his cell phone pressed against his ear as its ring resounded in his ear over and over. Finally, she picked up.
"Why are you calling me, Rodney?"
Laura asked. Her voice was tired and impatient, of the sort where it was clear that she had no time nor tolerance for bullshit. Not today, not from him. Rodney winced inside, and he felt his heart grow heavy and numb inside of him. He wanted to do so much. He wanted to beg her to come back. He wanted to demand to know what it was about him that made their relationship impossible. He wanted to slam the phone down on her. So many desires and contradictions, all of them flooding through him at once. But he didn't. He stuck to what he called her about. Laura, Rodney said tiredly, rubbing his eyes as he spoke. There's something from your grandmother here. She died. I'm sorry. She died and she left you something and it got mailed here. There, that was it. He'd given her the message, and thus any day now, she'd be by to pick it up.
Rodney, I can't. I'm leaving the country tomorrow morning.
Her voice was short, impatient, to the point. Okay, fine. Come by and pick it up when you get back. He was starting to get pissed off at her by this point. He calls her to come deal with her bullshit that was on his plate, and she was giving him attitude? The fuck?
I'm not coming back.
The statement was quiet and clipped, and it hit him like a train rushing down the line at full speed. His mouth dropped silently open, and that was the moment where it really hit him that it was over. There was no going back. There was no miracle chance, like in the movies, that they'd get back together. It was over. He wanted to ask her where she was going. He wanted to ask her if he'd ever see or speak to her again. He wanted to beg her to stay. He didn't, though. He didn't because he knew that now, as hard as it was really none of his business where she went or what she did. It also made him aware that he was stuck with the package, because he knew the answer to the question he asked next before it even left his mouth. So I'm assuming you won't want to give me your address for me to mail this thing to you?
No, I won't.
Calm and quiet, but to the point. No bullshit, no time for it. All right, fine, Rodney said, trying to keep calm, to not get emotional. Have a nice life, Laura. You can guess how it ended. She hung up, he hung up. For the rest of the day, he laid in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to think of nothing. It was a week later that he finally noticed the box again. Up to that point, he'd been more or less going through the motions. Wake up, have breakfast, get dressed, work, home, dinner, undress, and get into bed. He wasn't sure why he was going about things that way, not consciously. He just felt, deep down, that it was all he had left. This was life, and how utterly, maddeningly, and terrifyingly empty it was. He didn't think about much in those days. Nothing except Laura and what they had, to be honest. The more he thought about what they had had, and that was now gone, the more he wondered how he'd ever move on, how he'd ever be able to enjoy life, to live. He trucked on, though. He had to. What else could you do? There was something else, though. It was the box. It caught his eye in a particularly odd way one day as he ate his breakfast, then as he left for work. When he got home, it was there, same as it always had been. There was something about it, though, that hadn't been there when he'd left for work. It appealed to him in some way he couldn't describe. Standing there at the edge of his living room, the front door having clicked shut mere moments ago, he stared at it. He noticed every nook and cranny of the box in a way he hadn't before. How the cardboard seemed worn and faded, with minor little tears and creases situated all over it. The duct tape was no better, the edges of it peeling upward ever so slightly. Then there was the smell. He hadn't noticed that before. It smelled musty, like old cotton. It reminded him of his parents' attic when he was a child, the dust creating a thick haze as the smell of old times and old dreams percolated in the air. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he was moving. He was walking over to the box. Then he was on his knees. Then he was ripping the duct tape off the box and tearing the folds open to see what was inside. He furrowed his brow as he looked into the now open box. It was a blanket, just a simple, ordinary blanket. It was a soft blue and looked old, slightly faded and discolored here or there, but not necessarily worn. He sat there on his knees for about half a minute, his confusion and then frustration rising within him. What the hell was this? It was just a blanket? Finally, out of nowhere, a dam broke inside of him, and a furious rage flooded into him. The rage that he'd thought he'd had something good, something he could enjoy, but it turned out to be nothing. Something so insignificant and trivial and not even worth getting upset over, but nevertheless had the sheer anger bubbling forth. He stared down at the blanket inside of the box, and the anger, the sheer anger bubbling up inside of him. He screamed as loud as he could, the rage bellowing out of him. And as he screamed, he felt flood into him the abject helplessness and hopelessness flood into him. The helplessness and hopelessness that stemmed from the reality that she was never coming back, that none of it had ever meant anything, not really, and that all those years of his life was gone, gone forever, like a raindrop that's fallen from the air and into a vast, endless pond. He screamed that way for a whole minute, and then the tears broke forth. The tears stormed forth down his face as his hurt sobs echoed throughout the apartment. Stumbling into his room, he sobbed into his pillow, feeling like he wanted to die, until finally he drifted off into a mournful sleep. As he slept, the blanket sat in the living room, silent, comfortable looking. Oh, so comfortable looking. Soft, too. He woke up the next day feeling like he'd rather be dead. Going through the motions, he brewed himself some coffee. Minutes later, he was sipping the steaming hot black liquid as he moved over to the couch, gently setting himself down on it so as not to upset the cup in his hand. He was still wearing his disheveled clothing from the night before. He didn't care. He reached over to the remote control on the couch and, picking it up, flicked the TV on. Anything to occupy his mind. Anything to get his mind off of her. As he watched a variety of television shows and news broadcasts, he noticed that nothing really filled the deadened void inside of him, the void that had been there since she left. He felt his heart beat more rapidly and himself start to fidget in tension and anxiety as he wondered if he would ever get better, ever move past this. It was a few hours later when he realized he was cold. Later on, even at the end, he wasn't sure if it was this that caused him to look over at the blanket in the box, or if it was something else. Regardless, he looked over at it. As he stared at it, something happened to him, or rather his perception of the blanket. It looked softer than it had before. It looked ever so slightly bigger, ever so slightly fluffier than it had. It didn't look nearly as old as it had before. In fact, now it looked brand new. And he felt cold. He didn't know how, but now he felt so cold. It wasn't a hard choice. Really, it wasn't. He just set his cup down on the coffee table and moved, a bit too quickly at that, over to the box. As he picked the blanket out of the box, he was utterly struck by the feel of it on his fingers. It was so warm and soft, and not just that, but inviting too. Holding it in front of him with both hands, he squeezed it, letting its soft fullness expand within his squeeze to fill his grip, to press against his palms. It was the softest, most wonderful piece of material he'd ever felt. He felt better now. Somehow, the blanket had made him feel like it was all right that Laura left, because stuff like that happens all the time, right? Life happens. What can you do? He pressed the blanket against his chest, feeling its warm fullness. Rodney yawned and stretched as he did so. All of a sudden, all he wanted to do was crawl into a nice couch or bed with the blanket on top of him and drift off to sleep. It was weird, though. He'd just gotten up and was more or less up until a few seconds ago. Whatever, Rodney thought to himself. Maybe he hadn't gotten enough sleep last night and it was just now catching up with him, right? Yeah, that was probably it. Rodney nodded to himself, stepping toward the couch. He felt heavier now, more sluggish. It was only a few feet, a few short feet, but when he finally reached the couch, he fell on top of it, completely drained. The couch's cushions sinking beneath him, along with the comfortable, inviting blanket laying over top of him, felt so good. Yawning and stretching some more, he knew he couldn't get up and do things around the house, even if he wanted to. He was too tired. Just way too tired. He could hardly get off the couch at this point, even. If he had been thinking more clearly, he would have realized that it didn't make sense that he would go from functional to completely drained in the span of a few seconds. He wasn't, though. All that was on his mind was comfort, sweet, sweet comfort, and rest. By the time 5 minutes was past, he was fast asleep, his snores filling the house. When Rodney woke up the next day, at first he didn't know what time it was. Groggily grabbing for the remote control on the coffee table, he finally felt it. Grabbing hold of it, he switched the TV on and changed to the weather channel. Squinting at the screen, the dull haze of sleepiness still present in his vision, his eyes widened in surprise as they finally registered what was on the screen. It was 3 in the afternoon, a day after he'd fallen asleep. He'd slept over 24 hours, and, well, he felt great, come to think of it. In fact, as he pulled himself off the couch and thought about it more, this was the best he'd felt in years. He felt refreshed, full of energy, fully charged, and not just that. He felt happy. He felt like all he wanted to do was smile, to go out on the street and build everyone out there up so they could have a sliver of what he felt. Excitement and energy from out of nowhere coursing through his veins. He realized he had to get out. He had to burn off some steam. 15 minutes later, he was wearing some jogging clothes and was out the door. Then, 5 minutes after that, his feet were pounding the pavement as he ran hard, harder, and more joyfully than he ever had. His heart pumping hard and his feet pounding the pavement just as hard. He was on top of the world. He ran for 3 miles and then walked home. Getting home, he collapsed onto his couch, pulling the blanket, his new precious blanket, over him and drifting off to sleep in seconds. As he faded into sleep, all that was in his mind was how warm and comfortable he was. This blanket was perfect for him. He didn't think of how absurd it was that he was undergoing such a radical change out of nowhere. He didn't think about how he no longer even cared to think about Laura even though she had been such a huge part of his life, and how her departure had left such a gaping wound in his heart. None of these things ever occurred to him. The next day, he spent the day out running, and then exploring the city. Walking down the crowded city streets of downtown, he felt so alive. The energy was pounding through his veins, and at times, he felt like he was about to burst. He could do anything, he felt. The sun was shining, and everything seemed so bright and full of life. The people racing to their various destinations, the cars moving down the street, even the buildings. He'd never seen the world like this before, and it left him in star-struck awe. Later, munching on a bagel as he strolled down a busy sidewalk, he began to make plans for himself. He'd leave his job, that much was certain. He'd travel. Yeah, he'd travel. He'd go to Europe and Asia, and he'd meet someone, that special someone, and he'd make her respect him, not like that bitch Laura, that goddamn bitch Laura. Thinking about her, he felt rage build up inside of him, and he felt his heart warm as he imagined himself with his hands around her throat, her life being choked out of her. For a brief moment, a conflicted thought entered his mind. What's wrong with me? I love Laura. But just as soon as it was there, it was gone, and the image of him forcing her to gasp for breath and life in an utterly futile manner filled his mind yet again. Getting home, he took his shirt off and threw it on the dining table. Kicking his shoes off, he collapsed onto the couch and pulled the blanket over himself. He felt joy wash over him as he felt its touch again. He'd been looking forward to cuddling up with the blanket and watching some TV, and that's exactly what he did. For the next 5 hours until midnight, the blanket was wrapped around him, keeping him warm, and the TV's sounds echoed throughout the apartment, the glow of its screen flickering across the walls. As he watched TV, he didn't notice that he felt a good deal numb across his body. He didn't notice much recently. As the clock neared 1 in the morning, he yawned and switched the TV off. Laying down on the couch, he was asleep seconds later. He didn't get out of bed the next day. He just lay there, wrapped in the blanket, so warm, soft, pleasurable. There was something about this blanket. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something. Every time he tried to think about it, though, his mind went somewhere else. Oh well, he finally thought to himself. It probably wasn't important anyway. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? As he lay there on the couch, he couldn't feel his legs. At this point, he noticed it, but he didn't care. He honestly didn't. No one could tell you why, not even him. But for some reason, it just wasn't important to him. One thing he made sure of. He made sure the blanket remained draped over him. He was too comfortable, too at peace. If the blanket fell off of him, the chill would get to him, and he wouldn't be able to relax or get comfortable for the rest of the day. This he was certain of. So it was that for the rest of the day, the blanket covered him completely, only his head exposed. He didn't wake up for another 2 days. When he awoke, he was hungry. Hungry and angry. Out of nowhere, as the haze of grogginess receded, Thoughts began to run through his mind. Thoughts of how he'd been wronged and betrayed. That miserable fucking bitch Laura, he thought to himself. Just fucking like her to leave, after all he'd fucking done for her. He began to imagine him taking a knife and taking it to her face and making her feel what he felt. As the thoughts of that filled his mind, his heart began to beat faster and faster, and he began to get more and more worked up. Yeah, he thought to himself, he should go and track her down and make her understand. All that he could feel or perceive was pure, raw, frothing hatred. He hated everything about her now. He hated how she'd wasted the years he'd given her, and now he wanted to act on that. It didn't matter that just a few days ago he'd loved her and mourned her loss, that back then he'd have done anything to have her back, that he'd have done anything to change himself if it meant having her back. He'd changed. So it was that he resolved to buy the sharpest, deadliest knife he could find, and then find where Laura was and pay her a visit. Deciding upon this, he tried to get up, but he couldn't. He tried to stretch and swing his legs off the couch, but he couldn't. Something was stopping him. Confused and growing more and more enraged, he tried to pull the blanket off his body so he could get a look at his legs and see what was wrong. It wouldn't work. The blanket clung to his body. Furious, he tried to throw the blanket off of him and force himself to stand up. As he tried, with all of his strength, he found that he could barely even move. His strength had left him. A flood of emotions raced through him, primarily rage. Rage at Laura, at his mother, at all the awful and horrible fucking people in the world who used him, who never appreciated him. All those people whose throats he now wished he could slash open. As helpless, impotent rage built inside of him, he screamed. But even his scream was weak and pitiful, lacking energy or strength. As agonizingly long minutes passed, he sobbed. He sobbed so hard that sleep came quickly and in a bout of surprise. Later, he wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep and how long he'd been awake. He shivered. He was always shivering now. The blanket had eaten his legs entirely by this point and had now eaten through most of the flesh and bone of his arms, in addition to most of the flesh of his stomach. Soon it would devour his internal organs, and then the rest of him. It had now expanded to cover his head, and he felt it sucking away at his skull, licking up his hair, and gradually dissolving the bone and flesh, protecting his brain. He no longer felt rage or hatred toward Laura or anyone else. He just felt fear. Raw fear. He had no idea what would happen to him now, but one thing remained steadfast in his mind. He was thankful, so thankful that Laura hadn't been here to receive the blanket. Tears coursing down his face as he thought of this. He was thankful that it was him this was happening to and not her. Rodney hadn't been heard from in 2 weeks, and that wasn't like him at all. So his parents, living just a half-hour drive away from Rodney, finally worked up their courage and, being completely ready to bear the brunt of Rodney's anger and indignation if it turned out it was nothing, called the police. One thing led to another, and before you knew it, The manager of Rodney's apartment was unlocking the door to his tenant's apartment so the police could search it. They found nothing out of the ordinary, but Rodney wasn't there. One thing they did find, however, a blue blanket, warm and comfy looking, albeit a bit discolored, draped over the couch. There was also something else. Something so small, so out of the way that no one, not the police, not the manager, not even Rodney's family when they showed up to collect his things, ever noticed it. A very small drop of blood just beneath the couch. Rodney was never found.